further ado, we will get into the talking points of today's episode. Now, to begin with, which powers were involved in Italy in the 19th century and what were their respective roles?
Okay, so we have three powers playing. So we have Austria, due to their they had a very historical link with Italy, of course. Numerous emperors of Austria hold many possessions within Italy, whether it be the Duchy of Naples, held within the Habsburg family since the 16th century, of course, and Lombardy, famously as well. Of course, we have the French with their very more lingual relations. Of course, we think of the Alps as this very dividing line. I think that's not as true as we like to think. And of course, French influence, of course, under the auspices of the Catholic Church with the Papal States south in the southern areas. Of course, then of Spanish Habsburgs also having their links in as well, of course, very much in parallel with Austria. And what we very much see is before 1871, for a good chunk of history, effectively since the medieval age, that European powers have always been able to have use Italy as a playground due to the lack of nation building.
Anything to add?
Yeah, sorry. I feel like it would also be a bit remiss of me not to mention the effect that Prussia indirectly had upon the Italian peninsula, as Piedmont Sardinia in and of itself was not a country or nation equipped well enough to take on the Austrian behemoth, which occupied such Italian icons such as Venice. You can't have Italy without a Venice, really. So when the Austrian-Prussian War of 1866 happened, the Italians would join on the side of the Prussians, allowing them to gain these footholds in northern Italy, which had previously seemed almost unattainable to them. And then furthermore, when the North German Confederation with the southern German states, eventually the German Empire, would go to war against the Second French Empire under Charles-Louis Napoleon Bonaparte III, French troops were withdrawn from the Papal States, allowing the Italian state, to finally take back Rome.
Well, yes, they also, Prussia, as you mentioned before, was also incredibly significant with regard to the Piemonte, as I will call it, their Piemonte Sardinia's alliance with France, because of course, during the Second War of Independence, I believe, they obviously engaged in war with Austria, but out of fear of Prussian involvement on the side of Austria, right, France decided they were going to do secret negotiations with the Habsburgs over territory, and of course they promised that the Austrians would grant them, I believe, Lombardy. Was it Lombardy?
I believe a large part of Lombardy.
Yes, large part of Lombardy, in exchange for the Piedmontese not going into the middle regions of Italy, which were run by the Habsburgs, I believe, as well, right?
Yeah. Habsburg or Habsburg allied.
Yes. So, but obviously the French did not back this treaty, and we'll get on to that later and how that led to unification. But of course Prussia was indirectly very, very involved in this. Now, okay, anyone else want to add whether, also how these foreign powers were received by their subjects?
Yes, I think, the Austrians have been powers within Europe for centuries, before the Austrian Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, which of course it expanded all the way down to Rome in about the 13th century. The Austrians very much see themselves almost, very much superior to the Italians at this point. They're very much, along with the Ottomans, the sick men of Europe in the fact that effectively since ancient Rome, they haven't played anywhere near a significant role within European politics, and they have been a playground for the European powers. As a result, the Italians very much feel that just as, whether the Indians or Africa seeing this idea of European powers think they have a right to their own land, doesn't usually go very well with native populations, and as a result, seeing quite a lot of anger towards, especially the Austrians, who are, of course, the longest players in this game.
Well, considering our series over the next 3 episodes will be related to the creation of nations, I really wanted to bring in the idea of ideas in how they bring about the creation of a unified nation, how Mazzini's Young Italy formed as a reaction to the actions of these powers. Does anyone want to explain that, or should I?
Sure, you really want to do that?
Well,
sure,
I can.
Go on.
Okay, so Mazzini had a lot of issues with, with the Austrians in particular, based on their reforms. So, for example, they introduced things like conscription and also heavy anti-clerical measures. Now, of course, everyone knows that Italy is a very strictly Catholic country, and when they did things like church confiscation, church land confiscation, and all those things, made them very, very unpopular with the Italians. Now, of course, Mazzini set up the Young Italy movement, and he was for a very long time regarded to be the sort of spearhead of the Italian unification movement. Leo, you have something to add?
I feel like it would be once again completely remiss of us to not mention the most famous, objectively member of the Young Italy movement, of Giuseppe Garibaldi.
Yes.
Who for most of his time post joining Young Italy would actually spend his time in South America, interestingly, immersing himself in the gaucho culture and fighting a series of small civil wars in and around Brazil and some actually in Uruguay, and would actually go on to find his wife and many other close and go on to find his soon-to-be wife, who would bear his children, and also be an important factor within most of the battles and the wars that the young Italian state would find itself in.
I mean, I think it's important not to understate that the Italian population was actually very apathetic to Italian unification. When we talk about these figures, these are seen pretty radically. Although Italians don't like their occupiers, the French, the Austrians, they're not willing to personally fight for unification themselves. I mean, it's been hundreds of years like this. It took Germany was disunited for a long, long, long time. And Garibaldi and Cavour, they do implement their policies, but they don't necessarily envision a united Italy from the start. Cavour only seeks unification of the industrial north, and it's more of a European event which causes the Italians to then see an opening in unification.
Well, in the first Italian War of Independence that I mentioned beforehand, with King Charles Albert of Piedmont, Sardinia, it collapsed really due to the lack of cooperation between the Italian states involved, which were, I believe, Milan, Piedmont, Sardinia, and then it was one of the ones that the Austrian Habsburgs ran. Was it Venetia? Yeah, Lombardy, Venetia. Right. Yeah, exactly those ones. So there was some deal of. I would slightly object to that on the basis there was some deal of anti-colonial sentiment within the country because of this uprising. But yeah, Leo, go on.
Just to further emphasise how long it had been since a unified Italy in support of, well, really either point that you see. The last time that Italy was truly properly unified under a single, well, let's say Latin conqueror at this point, was actually under Belisarius of the Byzantine Empire. And that was the last time that Italy had seen proper reunification, I believe.
Yeah. I think you're both right in the fact that yes, of course, throughout the whole country there's anti-colonial sentiment. I think what we haven't mentioned yet, of course, is the North-South divide in Italy, which is, we like to talk about it here in England. I think it's very massive within Italy because the North sits in its, you have the Apennines, which splits every state into its own little culture. As a result, we have all these states being quite separate. But also you have the North, which, of course, industrialized and, of course, very much plays within the European game. Whereas, of course, the southern states, Naples and Palermo, is actually very old, but also medieval and very agricultural-based economies, of course, surrounding Rome, very fertile land, but very uneconomically advanced. And as a result, very much the modern Italy we see today is that imbalance that, as we'll go on to talk about later, has never actually truly properly been resolved.
Well, thank you very much, Hashim, because you very, very neatly led us on to the next question, which was how united was Italy prior to 1861? Leo, do you want anything to say about that? Go
on. I would make the point that it was an extremely disunified and force or region within Europe. In fact, the only common force I'd really point to all Italians being against was actually under Napoleon all the way back in the early 1800s, when he would establish a number of his own relatives and his own commanders and generals in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, in Piedmont, Sardinia, and in other parts of the region. They might have been renamed, I'm not quite so sure about that. But anyways, going into 1861, there were many, many very separate, very, very distinct regions and cultures within Italy, as alluded to by Hashim. And so I'd make the point that it was very, very disunified.
Right. Okay, anyone want to add to that? Ibrahim?
I mean, even though it was obviously very unified, there are things which did unify them. You know, the unification of other countries around them and their growing strength sort of forced Italians into unification. And although they spoke, you know, accents and sometimes languages which were very different, there'd always been an idea of a state, you know, separated by the Alps on a peninsula, and those cultural ideas from Rome, from the Byzantines, and the ideas of the trading cultures, the society, that those did exist, and that, you know, you can't just make a state out of nothing, although that they were apathetic towards it. When Italian unification did come for them, they did accept it with open arms. The leaders gave up their states and their nobility so that Italian unification could happen. They did envision it.
Yeah, it's a great point you raised there, because the ideas of Italian unification were even propagated by key figures in the Renaissance, such as Cesare Borgia and Machiavelli, and also Dante Alighieri as well. So sorry, my pronunciation might be terrible. At least I tried. Also with regard to languages, you know, you have like Leo and Hashim alluded to beforehand, it really is a symbol of the different influences in the region. So, for example, in northern Italy, the Gallo-Italian is very Germanic and French, whereas in southern Italy, in areas like Sardinia, which is technically not southern Italy, but it's close, it's much closer to Latin. Now, yeah, that's a really good summation of why Italy was so disunited. Leo, you had something to add?
Just to emphasise how much of a driving force this like local Italian patriotism is, the Italians actually have a word for this. I definitely am not going to say this right. Called campalismo, I believe. Very sorry for that horrible pronunciation. But even today, after really over a century of Italian unification, it's still a very, very deciding factor within Italian politics, just to emphasise how much of a major factor this is. So if it's such a massive factor now, after so much time of Italian unification, just imagine the magnitude it would have been amplified to back in the time of 1860s.
Yeah, and of course, famously, the current Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, was, of course, famously mocked by especially many northern Italian newspapers about her very strong Roman, very southern accent. Famously.
Right, yes, so that's very interesting. And I also wanted to get involved in something that isn't necessarily in the questions, but is something that I actually think is very, very important to the Italian unification, which is the French Revolution. How do we think that influenced ideas of revolution? Oh, not revolution. Well, I suppose, yes, it's revolution against colonialism, but also just the general theme of Italians ruling themselves. This idea, as propagated by people like Mazzini, of every man being equal, and all those kinds of utopian ideas, shall we say? Anyone? Okay, go on.
When the French occupied Italy, they were famously a very, very unpopular rulers within Italy itself. And this actually would go a large way towards forming this idea of reviving almost this idea of the Italian nation state, because there was a common enemy to unite against, for all Italian peoples to stand against, that being, of course, the French.
I think, of course, we've had multiple French revolutions. I think in 1789, of course, it's very much... we have the monarchies of Europe very much reacting very malignantly to this revolution in France. While still, after 1848, and eventually, of course, in 1830 as well, and of course, what would come in the 1871 after Italy and the Franco-Prussian War, I think people are far more used to the idea of revolution. They're far more willing to deal with violence, and I think many people in Europe see that. For example, in Britain, avoided revolutions mainly because Parliament gives in to the people and makes just enough reforms to get by. Whereas in Europe, you see the European powers, the Habsburgs, especially Habsburgs and the French, all really quite holding on very conservatively. And what it's doing is it's creating the environment that was before in 1789, where people are just so angry with the system that it's not about working with the system. They just quite literally want to break the system down, that we see constantly.
Well, that's a very good point, Hashim. And also what I wanted to raise in further conjunction to France is the idea that we'll probably see more consistently amongst the next 3 episodes about self-determination after being within an empire, and how those ideas also form the ideas of unification within places like Italy, where we've seen it, for example, in the Middle East post-Ottoman Empire. Yeah. So, Ibrahim, if you had something to add?
The French Revolution is almost a rebirth, a second renaissance of ideas, nationalism. Napoleon makes the Confederation of the Rhine. He redraws Italian states. He ends Austrian influence for a time. But what this really does is it gets that apathetic population thinking, believing that Italy can be united. And when you had the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the Italian, the Piedmont Sardinian king, he talks about Italian unification, and that really legitimizes the whole idea of Italian unification because of the French Revolution and Napoleon. Right.
So also, whilst we've discussed the ideas at length, I want to get into how they did it sort of by force. How did they unify Italy, the Piedmontese Sardinian kingdom? How did they expand so rapidly and take it? Now, the figure I want to start with is Conte di Cavour. How was he so influential in this process? Can anyone say? Right. Okay. Well, the Conte di Cavour is someone who's I would consider him to be quite Machiavellian in his political manoeuvring. I mean, he did the majority of it. So, like what I said before about how the French negotiated that armistice with the Austrians out of fear to Prussian involvement in the Second War of Independence, Cavour managed to not only get Lombardy but also march into the middle ground in Italy. And he also ceded Nice and Savoy to France to sort of keep them sweet, as it were, and make sure that they didn't revoke their backing, because that would obviously mean that Austria would retaliate to Italy for invading Habsburg allied territory. So this decision obviously created a rift between him and Garibaldi. And Garibaldi essentially just went down south and decided he was going to take lots of land in Sicily. Now, Garibaldi was obviously a very revered military commander within this movement. So he moved in from the south, and Garibaldi attacked from the northwest of Italy downward. Piedmont's like northwest Italy, right? So northwest Italy downwards into the middle, and they met in southern Italy, sort of near the heel of the boot, as it were, and Garibaldi realised that, of course, he could not compete with this numerically superior, well, not enemy, but competitor for Italian territory. So, of course, it all came together. Now, anyone wants to say what happened after that? Go on, Leo.
Sorry, could you just repeat the question very quickly?
Right, yeah. So I was just talking about when Garibaldi and the Piedmontese forces under Cavour, who was the prime minister of that kingdom under the King Victor Emmanuel, met sort of in southern Italy, near the kind of heel of the boot, and Garibaldi realised that he'd have to merge the land he'd acquired with the Italians, with the Piedmontese. Sorry.
I'd quickly like to alight on the land that you said he acquired in the so-called famous expedition of the 1000 in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. So, after a marriage to an 18-year-old woman, there were uprisings in Messina and Palermo, which notably were in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, and this provided Garibaldi with a very valuable opportunity that he really couldn't pass off. So he gathered a group of red shirt volunteers, the red shirts being, of course, these soldiers under Garibaldi's command. They found their roots in his gaucho days of South America, and they would set off from Genoa and eventually land in the westernmost point of Sicily. And he would swell his army with ranks of volunteers and scattered bands of local rebels, as well as parts of the army did go and join Garibaldi. And finally, Garibaldi would see to himself that he could overtake and really conquer the kingdom of the two Sicilies without having to subject northern armies to a long, grueling campaign of working down the peninsula. Rather, he would provide a valuable opportunity to turn the kingdom of the two Sicilies over without really having Piedmont Sardinia to commit too many forces to it.
Right. Very good, gentlemen. That concludes our episode of 21 Minutes in the Past. We hope you've enjoyed listening to it as much as we've enjoyed recording it. Of course, the fortnightly bonanza and roller coaster ride that it is, especially this week with our computer-based mishaps, which I will not go into. Leave to your imagination. But we're very thankful for you, the listener, to listening to it and getting this far. And we will be joining you in 2 weeks to discuss the creation of the State of Israel, which will be a very topical matter at the moment. Yes, no shouting, no shouting. We will be very civil because, of course, we're historians. Now, thank you very much and goodbye.